Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on January 10th, 2026. We are only 10 days into the new year and already it appears as though the West's war on the Russian Federation is escalating to unprecedented levels. In those 10 days, I should say, U.S. naval forces seized 2 oil tankers bearing the Russian flag. In addition, after initially accepting that Ukraine attacked a residence of Vladimir Putin at the end of 2025, the Trump regime reversed course about a week into the new year and accused effectively the Russians of lying. They did so after Russia's intelligence services provided what it said was proof of the attack to the U.S. government. In response to these provocations, Russia launched a hypersonic Oreshnik missile into western Ukraine, only about 70 kilometers from the Polish border. Meanwhile, the Trump regime has kidnapped Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who I think can fairly be described as a friend of the Russian Federation, and has demanded that Venezuela's government sever economic ties with Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. Trump is also threatening another ally of Russia, or at least a friend of Russia, namely the government of Iran. So when we add it all up, we are, I think, justified in asking how close are we now to a full-blown war between the Russian Federation and the United States? To help answer this question, we're pleased to welcome back onto our program the inimitable John Helmer. John is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Russia and the only Western journalist to direct his own bureau independent of national or commercial ties. Born and educated in Australia, then at Harvard, John has also been a professor of political science, sociology, and journalism, and an advisor to governments, including the lowly governments of Greece and Australia. He has also published numerous books on military and political topics, his latest being Long Live Novichok, the British Poison, which Fooled the World. Thank you very much for joining us today, John, to discuss these extraordinarily important events.
Thank you for having me, Dimitri. Good to be back.
So I'd like to start today, John, with the seizure of these Russian-flagged oil tankers. And just to be clear, it's my understanding that they're not actually owned by Russians or by the Russian government, but they were...
Let me correct. First, there's only one tanker that's been seized. That's the Marinara. And second, there is a second Russian flag tanker, the Hyperion. Both of them are not only Russian flagged, but Russian owned, although the ownership has been changing relatively recently. But those are small details. We'll come to the bigger picture just as you've expressed it. So please forgive me for the interruption there. One tanker, both Russian flagged recently, both Russian owned. One, the Marinara, seized and boarded and taken, and the other sailing away on its way to Ust-Luga.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, and we'll come back to exactly what's happened here. It's important that we get that I get these facts straight. So the U.S. Navy seized the Marinara, which I believe was previously using the name Bella 1, in the North Atlantic, not too far from Scotland. And I'd like to show our audience what Russia's foreign ministry had to say in response to this seizure. So you can see up here a statement issued on, it looks like the 8th of January. And I'm just going to read the highlighted portions, which were the ones I thought were most pertinent. International maritime law, and this is the third paragraph, explicitly grants the flag state exclusive jurisdiction over its vessels on the high seas. Stopping and inspecting a vessel in international waters permitted only under narrowly defined circumstances, such as suspected piracy or slave trading, neither of which applied to the Marinara. In all other cases, such actions require the consent of the flag state, which in this instance is Russia. Not only did Russia refuse to provide such consent, it formally protested to U.S. authorities in recent weeks over the continued pursuit of the Marinara by the U.S. Coast Guard vessel. And then the next paragraph, under these circumstances, the boarding and de facto seizure of a civilian vessel on the high seas by U.S. military personnel, along with the detention of its crew, can only be viewed as a gross violation of fundamental principles and norms of international maritime law and the freedom of navigation. And at the very end, what I thought was an interesting comment Suggestions from certain U.S. officials that the seizure of the Marinara is part of a broader strategy to establish Washington's unlimited control over Venezuela's natural resources are profoundly cynical, and we categorically reject such neo-colonial ambitions. Now, I personally thought that that was an entirely appropriate tone for the Russian Federation to adopt. However, subsequent to the seizure, it was reported that two of the individuals who were, I think, members of the crew, it's not entirely clear exactly what their capacity was, but in any case, they're Russian citizens, and they were released by the rogue Trump regime. And here's what Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson of the Russian Federation's foreign ministry, had to say on the following day, so this would be the 9th. In response to our appeal, U.S. President Donald Trump has made a decision to release 2 Russian nationals from the crew of the oil tanker. We welcome this decision and express our gratitude to the U.S. leadership, and we are beginning immediate action on all issues related to ensuring the prompt return of our fellow citizens to their homeland. And that was basically it. That was a rather terse statement. But what struck me about this, John, I mean, and sometimes the Russians seem to be diplomatic to a fault, because they're basically expressing gratitude to a war criminal who has illegally seized or ordered naval forces of the United States to illegally seize a Russian-flagged vessel. So at the end of the day, why is the Russian government thanking Trump for releasing them after it committed what the Russian government rightly characterizes as a flagrant violation of international law?
The why has to be answered politically, Dimitri. At the moment, and we'll come back to the bigger strategic picture in a little while. At the moment, there are obvious factional differences about what's to be done. First, when you flag a vessel with your flag, when a country puts its flag on the vessel that's going to carry cargo, it not only registers it for insurance and movement purposes, it commits to defending its flag as tenaciously as any army defends its flag. The flag of the monarch, the standard of the army, is for military personnel sacred. It must always be defended, and on a battlefield, the flag is always defended by the elite forces on a battlefield since ancient times, right? We all understand that. So the question is, who decided on the reflagging? It was announced by the Russian Transport Ministry that the Marinara had been granted a temporary reflagging as a Russian vessel. Was that agreed by the Foreign Ministry? Was that agreed by the Defense Ministry, by the Russian Navy, and thus by the Kremlin, and thus by President Putin, that the reflagging would require military defense? Because if you reflag, you've got to be prepared to defend your flag, right? First. Second, the Marinara wasn't the only tanker to be reflagged. The Hyperion, a products tanker, chemical products tanker, considerably lower capacity. There's the Hyperion. The Hyperion is a chemical products or oil products, petroleum products tanker of a capacity of about 300,000 barrels. The Marinara is a 2 million capacity tanker for crude oil. Quite different in capacity, quite similar in their operating function in the alt fleet. Let me call it the alternative fleet, and we'll come back to the difference between the alternative fleet and the Western fleet in a minute. But first of all, we have to understand who decided in Moscow to reflag these 2 vessels, but didn't decide how tenaciously they would be defended by air or naval or other military assets. Who and why in the outcome that you just described, Dimitri, was the Russian military defense of the Marinara so inadequate to the task first. So there's been a loss of the flag, something very serious from strategic point of view, because if it happens once, it invites escalation. Second, if there was a factional difference at the time of the reflagging at the beginning of January, there must have been a factional difference between the Defense Ministry, the Navy, and the Kremlin over what measures would be enough to defend the Marinara off the coast of northwest coast of Scotland, heading for Iceland, when the Americans, who had been practicing this boarding, I'd seen on the social media clips of the practice operations at the British base in Scotland for doing just this. So the Russian side knew it was coming. Why was the response so slow and so weak, relatively speaking? Just to say that it's not my expression that's weak. President Trump said on January the 8th, asked if he'd telephoned Putin after the tanker was seized. That was a Sean Hannity Fox interview on the 8th. Trump says, I'll quote, "I don't want to say that," meaning there was no telephone call. There was an exchange of message, though. But the fact is that the Russian ships, it was a submarine and a destroyer. I believe it was a corvette, not a destroyer. They both left very quickly when we arrived. We took over the ship and the oil is being unloaded right now. A couple of mistakes there. There's no oil in the Marinara. It's empty. All the maritime sources I've seen say it's empty. So Trump got that wrong. He actually wasn't all that clear about what vessels the Russian Navy had sent, but what he said was provocative. He was essentially spitting in the face of in the eye of the Russian Navy and said, we took over and they ran away. All right? So now, what happens then is, as you said, the foreign ministry issues a statement saying, treat the crew humanely. This is a very unusual statement to make in an atmosphere described legally by the Russian government and the foreign ministry as international piracy. Second, as you just said, Maria Zakharova, the spokesman for the foreign ministry, says thank you for the release, which means the foreign ministry negotiated with the Americans, let's say the State Department, for the release of the 2 crew members on board. By the way, the other crew members are dominated by Ukrainian nationals. Who knows whether Zelensky's going to get them back or not? And I'm told a Georgian or 2 are also on board. Now, it's unprecedented in the ancient history, maybe 2,000 years of the history of piracy, especially in from ancient Greek point of view or ancient Roman point of view for the Mediterranean, unprecedented that someone said that the victim, having been released, says thank you to the pirates. It's unprecedented. What Zakharova has said is unprecedented in the history of piracy. Did Peter Pan or Captain Hook, sworn enemies after Peter Pan cut off Hook's hand, ever say thank you to one another? Of course not. But let me tell everybody a little story, a real story about how piracy works in the Mediterranean, or used to work in old empire days. In 75 BC, Julius Caesar, then a young nobleman, aged 25, was on his way to Rhodes to study. I've forgotten what he was going to study. In any event, he was intercepted by Turkish pirates. They were called Cilicians at the time. Cilicia is around about where Tartus and Adana are now in Turkey. Caesar was captured and by pirates and ransomed. That's the way pirates work, right? Caesar, being a Roman nobleman, an empire nobleman, scorned the pirates' ransom price, said, you need to offer more because I'm worth much more. He appeared to be friendly with the pirates. The ransom was paid. Caesar went back home and then raised a military force and captured the pirates. And then what Caesar did was crucify them. Okay, now what's this story mean? Is Zakharova saying thank you to the pirates, a prequel, the preparation for a Julius Caesar type counterattack on the pirates? Or is it a retreat in front of the pirates? She and the foreign ministry need to clarify that. But you can imagine inside Moscow, there are many different views about how you deal in this situation with Trump. And so on the one hand, the Marinara has been seized. The technical legal basis, as I understand it, I haven't read the exact terms of the US court warrant that legalizes the seizure, is that on the international waters, the high seas, any state can seize a vessel if it's stateless, if there's reason to believe its flagging is forged or unlawful in some way. That's the justification for the US court to order the military attack. But the Russian side made very clear in the preliminaries it was legally Russian, and yet the flag was not defended. So at the moment of the seizure, it was piracy. It was not a legal capture of a stateless vessel. This is therefore triggers a range of Russian political factional arguments about what's to be done and what are the consequences of not doing anything, or Zakharova's thank you to the pirates. And then we have to go back in time in the sequence. The sequence of provocations from Donald Trump began with the attack on the Novgorod residence. We've talked about that last time, and our audience will remember that Putin's residence in the Novgorod region near Lake Valdai was attacked by a swarm of about 40 drones. We've discussed it. I don't think we need to go through the details. At the time, just as you said, President Trump said Putin had told him on the phone about it. Trump appeared to endorse the truthfulness of Putin. Then the US changed line and said it's all a pack of lies. The CIA said there was no attack on the residence. Subsequently, the head of Russian military intelligence, Admiral Kostyakov, delivered the evidence, and the Americans insulted him by sending a naval captain. Captains are message boys. And when the US sent a message boy to the head of Russian military intelligence, they were insulting the evidence, but the evidence stuck. The Americans changed their line. The official American line is there was a drone attack. It wasn't against Putin in his bed in the residence. It was a military facility nearby, which is the command control bunker, always associated with presidential residences. The issue of whether the Americans demonstrated they knew where President Putin was putting his head on the pillow that night is entirely left open. But that was the first attack. Then we have the attack on Caracas. Then we have the attack on the Marinara. And subsequently, we've had remarks from President Trump saying that Greenland must be taken by the United States because it's surrounded by Russian and Chinese ships. That particular floating vessel, the Greenland, must be protected by the United States from Russian and Chinese attack. Now, that's the sequence. So ask yourselves, because everyone who counts in Moscow is asking him or herself, who has escalation control here? Who initiates? Who responds and reacts? And then the strategic question for the Russian side to answer is, if you're losing escalation control, have you become a paper tiger? Are your warnings, are your military capacities ceasing to have escalation dominance? Are they ceasing to have deterrent effect? That's the strategic issue. When Ms. Zaharova says thank you to the pirates, it's confirmation of loss of escalation control, unless she has in mind the Caesar crucifixion comeback. Julius Caesar pulled that 75 BC, so approximately 2100 years ago. Is that what Russia intends to do? Okay, next point in the timeline here, another military fact on the ground, and thanks for raising it, Dimitri. The Oreshnik was fired. Finally, after all the military bloggers representing a variety of opinions in the military forces and in the general staff have been calling for the Oreshnik to be the response to the Novgorod attack. And indeed, and there you go, you can see the characteristic of warhead strikes, lightning strikes they look like, on the horizon. The Oreshnik was not only fired, take a look at the targeting, looks snowy, looks peaceful, but what's happened here is the destruction of the Ukrainian gas storage facility, a very large one, near the Polish border, between Lvov and the Polish border. That's not just a Ukrainian facility. The glowing is the ignition of the gas. What happened here was the destruction of European Union storage of gas for the winter season. For some reason unknown to me, the Europeans have been storing gas on Ukrainian territory, thinking that that gas storage would be safe from Russian attack. So by a Oreshnik attack on that facility, the Russian side reasserted escalation dominance, not only on the Ukraine battlefield, because there are more Oreshniki to come and more Ukrainian targets on the battlefield to come, especially command and control of the Ukrainian military. But the Russian side was saying, this is for you, Europe. They are saying we are not going to attack outside the Ukrainian battlefield. We are not going to trigger an attack on the Baltic states or the Germans or the French or the British who provoke us, constantly provoke us to doing so. We are not going to trigger an Article 5 NATO mutual defense provision, but we're going to attack you wherever we find you on the Ukrainian battlefield. So the Russian response, and let's discuss whether it's credible, is measured, calculated targeting of the Oreshnik plus all the other means, the drones, the caliber, all the other Russian missile capacities, both ballistic and cruise, against the targets on the battlefield, NATO, American, and Ukrainian targets, to reassert escalation dominance. That leaves unanswered the war at sea. But I think I've said enough. Let's go to the next point.
Well, I'd like to talk about the significance of the U.S. seizure of this vessel. John, it seems to me that this is a profound threat to the security of the Russian Federation, because look, we all know that this, I mean, those of us who have an ounce of objectivity and who care to make the appropriate inquiries,
Yeah.
that the sanctions war has failed. And, of course, it has done significant damage to the Russian economy. But in some ways, it may have actually helped the Russians to become more self-sufficient. But Russia's economy has not been destroyed, not even remotely close. There's nothing to suggest that that the sanctions have achieved their desired effect. And I think what's happening here, and this is not the first instance, of course, in which maritime civilian shipping, vessels carrying, commercial cargo have been attacked. Vessels that were either flagged by the Russian Federation or were serving the territory of the Russian Federation, transporting goods to or from the Russian Federation. It's not the first time they've been attacked, but this is the first time that the United States has forcibly boarded a vessel bearing the Russian flag. Now, so it seems to me what's probably going through the heads of these lunatics in Washington is, well, our sanctions war hasn't achieved its desired effect. We haven't been able to kill Russia's trade with the rest of the world. Let's just seize the damn vessels and put an end to it right then and there. Now, they don't have to actually seize them all. All they have to do is create in the minds of these maritime shipping companies, the notion that there is a significant risk that their vessel will be boarded by U.S. military forces if they, transport goods to or from Russia. And if, the maritime shipping industry comes to be of the view that this is a very significant risk, that in and of itself could have very detrimental impacts on Russia's trade with the rest of the world, and therefore a severely negative impact on the Russian economy. So to my mind, I think it's kind of slimy and sneaky, frankly, that the Americans, this is not out of character for Donald Trump, of course, to say, well, our position is that it isn't really a Russian flagged vessel. It's not legitimate. I think what they're doing is they're escalating to see how the Russians react. And if this doesn't precipitate what they regard as a dangerous, powerful response from the Russian Federation, then they'll take it a step further. And the next time they will seize a vessel with respect to which there's no question whether it has been properly flagged by the Russian Federation. So the question really for Russia is, and I think you've highlighted it quite nicely, has our response, persuaded these lunatics that if they take this a step further, there's going to be hell to pay? And my personal feeling about that, and John, just like you, I don't want to see any further escalation. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the interest of humanity would be served by seeing Russia attack the territory of a NATO country, but I'm strongly of the opinion at this stage that the only thing that's going to deter these people is if Russia strikes a military target outside of Ukraine and in a Western country or in international waters. I hope that I'm wrong about that, but I don't really see any evidence that the United States government has gotten the memo from Moscow that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. So I guess my question to you is two parts. Do you think my assessment of how serious a threat this is to the national security of Russia is correct? And second, if you agree with me, do you think that the Russians have gone far enough to deter the Americans?
A lot of bits of answer. Let me see if I can hold it in my head and answer piece by piece. Correct me if I fail. First, I don't think it's correct to describe the US side as lunatics. It may be psycho-neurologically speaking to describe Donald Trump as one of those, but it's a complete mistake and a misjudgment politically, militarily, to regard the people running Trump and the Trump gang, that's the family, Vitkov, Lutnick, et al., as lunatics. They're not. It's also a mistake that some US podcasters make of belittling their military capacities. First thing. Second, you're right. They're testing the readiness of the Russian side to respond to each of their stepwise escalations. And the way we expressed it was that the the escalation now reaches to Greenland, but on the way, there's been the tanker seizure not very far from Greenland, but on its way to Russia via Iceland.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt. I always want to intervene there and say, to be clear, what I mean by lunatics. What you just said is that they're testing the Russian Federation's result. I believe that that's lunacy. That is a very, very dangerous thing for them to be doing, particularly in the current environment, and particularly when you're dealing with a country that has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. There's absolutely no reason, no justification for them to be testing the Russian Federation in this way. So to me, that's lunacy. But, we don't have to quibble over the meaning of the word. I'm not saying that they're, medically insane. That's not what I mean. I mean, it's reckless, it's extremely dangerous, and there's no justification for it. That's, I guess, my point.
I think that's a valuable qualification, and it certainly deserves to be made with respect to the way, for example, the CIA is operating at the moment, compared to the way Stephen Miller, the sort of Goebbels of the US administration in the White House, how he speaks of violence as a legitimate exercise of US power. But let's come back stepwise. First of all, and we've said it before, and we need to make it clear, since the war started, the effect of sanctions war has been to split the entire oil and gas trade, and therefore the ocean-going fleets that move that trade, into pieces. And that's a fundamental change in the way in which the oil and gas trade moves by sea. So let's just get for everybody to understand the dimensions, because the so-called shadow fleet, the black fleet, the ghost fleet, the phantom fleet, these are adjectives used in the US and European press to minimize the size of the two fleets competing here. Let's call it the alt fleet, the alternative fleet. And on current estimations, I'm looking down at my papers, at the maritime industry's estimations, there are about 1,500 active vessels in the alt fleet, of which the Marinara, the Hyperion, were two. Okay? Now, compared to that 1,500 alt fleet, in the top 10 oil and gas movement fleets of the world, the top 10 commercial ones, dominated by China and Maersk of Denmark and a few others, the top 10 have about 1,500 fleets, 1,500 vessels. So they're about equal. Then there may be approximately a total, including all vessels, of somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 tankers. But for the time being, we can say the alt fleet is roughly the same size as the top 10 Western fleet, to call it that. If you take out China, you've got less. So the world is split now. The seas of the world are split now. And that's on that, as it were, strategic map. The US is basically saying, we are going to command the high seas and we will dictate the victory of our fleet against your fleet. That's what's going on. That's the test here. It becomes lunacy in the way you put it, Dimitri, if you think that the Russian side, to regain escalation control, must go to nuclear weapons. If, on the other hand, you calculate, and this is exactly how the US calculates, that there is damage to the Russian economy, there is a limit on what President Putin will do to respond. If you calculate that, and there's an expression of all of this in lots of analytical articles appearing in the US press in the last few days, including a piece just appearing in the Atlantic. The US side believes that escalating the pressure against Putin personally, the Russian economy, and the Russian fleet, they will trigger a Russian retreat on the battlefields that they have in mind. Why? And why is this rational from their point of view, even if the evidence doesn't establish it? Because on the one hand, President Putin's strategy is one battlefield at a time. We control the clock. We will cause attrition on the Ukrainian battlefield and exhaust and defeat the US, NATO, and the Ukraine. That's one battlefield at a time, our clock. That's the Russian strategy. Call that the Putin strategy. The US strategy, the NATO strategy, the coalition of the killing, as you call them, coalition of the willing strategy is more than one battlefield at a time, many battlefields at a time, and we will take control of the clock. At the same time, the European strategy is we are ready to sacrifice every Ukrainian if necessary. Population's already fallen from 40 million to around 20-25 million, and we will go on fighting the war against Russia on that battlefield for as many Ukrainian dead as we need to continue the war. And at sea, we will maximize, multiply the number of seas in which Russian flagged vessels can be threatened so that the Russian Navy will be exhausted, so that the Russian shore base capability to defend its vessels, the way the Americans use the British base to attack this one, will be exhausted. So each side thinks it can control the clock and can deter the other with escalation measures that are deterrent. The US is simply going up the escalation ladder and ignoring the Russian deterrence.
So, John, I think you've answered my first question, and sorry for putting to you a two-parter, but the second part was, do you think that this Oreshnik strike is going to be sufficient to deter further escalations of this nature by the US government?
Simple answer, no. But something that may be unpopular and unwelcome for our audience to hear is that there are profound differences and arguments in Moscow right now. First of all, after the consensus was use Oreshnik after the Novgorod attack on President Putin, there are a variety of views. And I mean, I need to point out that Russians are relatively democratic and relatively open about how they express policy and strategy. And even though it's Christmas time and President Putin's on holiday and silent, the arguments and my sources aren't silent. So at the start, before Oreshnik, there was a view that let's call it the understandings of Anchorage, which is a code word that's been used over and over by President Putin himself, by Foreign Minister Lavrov, and by others, to mean that the opportunity to make a deal favorable to the Russian terms for the Ukraine and to relieve sanctions war, the opportunity must be exploited as best and as fully as it can. The Anchorage understandings, however, look now to be absolutely empty. But as we came up this escalation ladder, there was an argument, let's not be provoked. And I'm looking at my notes of various sources I've talked to who have been saying things like, before Oreshnik, look, the world's being divided in spheres of influence. We'll let Trump have his Western hemisphere. He's got to let us have our neighborhood. The Chinese, likewise. The Indians, likewise. Each, and the Germans and the French, likewise. The idea then is we don't respond to each one of Trump's provocations, and we certainly don't respond to his way of speaking, his insults, his provocations about this or that, his lies, his grandstanding and staging. He'll be gone soon enough. We need, first, not to provoke. Second, we need to retain escalation control and deterrence. We need a pause because we know, with or without Trump, the US and its friends and allies will be testing us on more than one battlefield at a time. So after Oreshnik, the sources kind of changed their mind. They think, right, now the General Staff is doing what we thought of as a good idea all along, and everybody can talk about the Oreshnik moment. I can even claim to have coined that term months and months ago, but this stuff is retrospective clickbait. Let's not talk that way. Let's talk about how the Russian side and my sources and the military bloggers and analysts who appear on TV or in the newspapers talk after Oreshnik. The idea was, right, this is one battlefield at a time. And if necessary, we may have to use the Oreshnik more than once against more targets. But bear in mind what I've just said. That target was not only Ukrainian, and it's causing massive electric war damage. We can come to that in a minute. It was a target against European gas, massive European loss of gas for the winter lighting season. So one battlefield at a time, we may need to use Oreshniki, plural, to bring capitulation on the Ukrainian side. Now, that's after the Oreshnik attack on the Stri gas storage. What about, and you raise it, the issue of attacking the Russian flag tanker Marinara? How to respond to that? And again, there is let's say, a measured argument in which people of goodwill, patriots, not sellouts, not fifth columnists, say among themselves, to me and in the press, we must focus on the Russian priorities. We do not have the capacity, as the Americans presently do, to defend every vessel with a Russian flag at sea. We must focus on the one battlefield at a time and capture the clock. Attrition must work for us. The other argument is, but the adversary is using the clock of attrition against the Russian side at sea. What do we do about that? Now, here's where we get into a very sensitive area in which I'm not going to say what they're going to do. What they don't do is puff up their feathers and display the feathers as if they're capable of causing compliance on the other side. Just bear in mind that the other side is using so-called state terrorism. That's the description that Russia applies to the Ukrainian drone attack on Novgorod. State terrorism to make war. What's to prevent the Russian side? What is to prevent? Rhetorical question, real question. What's to prevent the Russian side from launching counterattacks against US attempts to board tankers, which can be ascribed to terrorist organizations?
Well, I would also go further. I mean, I readily acknowledge that the Russian Navy, its capacity to defend commercial vessels bearing the Russian flag is much more limited than the capacity of the US Navy to defend commercial vessels bearing the US flag. But there's way too much commercial maritime traffic out there for even the US Navy to send out an escort. So the Russians could quite easily pick out a target. They could pick out a US flag vessel that is not accompanied by military escort and seize it in waters close, not too far from Russia's own shores. So it seems to me that is likely to bring home to the people in Washington that Russia is not going to put up with this kind of behavior more than an Oreshnik strike on a target in Ukraine. And you're quite right to point out that this is a facility, this gas facility is of significant importance to the Europeans for some insane reason. Why they think they should be storing gas on Ukrainian territory, that's a mystery. But it didn't involve an energy source that's important to the United States. And it's the United States that's driving. So I don't want to see escalation, but I would have thought that if you're really trying to deter the Americans, you would do it by saying, look, we can play this game too. We don't want to, but if you're going to start seizing our vessels bearing our flag, then we consider your vessels bearing the United States flag to be fair game.
Well, the Russians are not going to, at the moment, for the time being, we're still in the stage on the Russian side of saying, we believe President Trump was sincere and genuine and committed at Anchorage, Alaska, with a set of understandings for achieving peace on the Ukrainian battlefield. So when you see the Russian side saying the Anchorage understandings are dead because President Trump has authorized his men and women to attack on the high seas our vessels and to attack one of our partners, the Maduro government in Venezuela, and to threaten to attack externally our strategic partner, Iran, and mobilizing internal fifth column protests for regime change in Iran, and on and on and on we go. When you hear the Russian side say the Anchorage understandings are dead, then you know we've reached the point that you suggested, that you recommended. But why should Russia say that now? Why not be ambiguous, especially since special operations, clandestine operations, which the CIA, the British, and the Germans are all planning all the time against Russia? Why signal your punch? I'm not going to signal punch. I'm simply saying the Russian side isn't going to signal its punch.
Right.
And there's a debate inside Moscow, notwithstanding everybody wants a Christmas and New Year holiday, over what to do next in secret and overtly. What the consensus is you don't say thank you to pirates. And that's where Zakharova made a profound mistake. But we know and credit the Russian side on the battlefield and in diplomacy and economic warfare to correct its mistakes. Mistakes get made.
Sure.
That one's going to be corrected. Now, this leaves another little issue open. During all of these provocations, escalation tests, if you like, Kirill Dmitriev, the representative of the Russian oligarchs and business, was in Paris negotiating with Stephen Witkoff, President Trump's bagman, for continuing terms of ending the war. You might say it's impossible to negotiate a business-to-business relationship between Russia and the United States in the future for the same reasons that Trump has dictated he's going to take Venezuela for U.S. business and proposes to do the same to Greenland for U.S. business. How can Dmitriev negotiate in good faith with Witkoff for U.S. guarantees of a business relationship when it's clear the Trump administration doesn't have that approach to business? It's establishing, let's be clear, and then come back to Dmitriev, what the U.S. is establishing in Venezuela, threatening Greenland and elsewhere, the East India Company model what was that? Well, in the starting in the late 15th century with the Portuguese going through the 16th century, the monarchs of Europe, the ambitious ones, the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish, licensed the formation of concessionaire companies. These were basically merchant adventurers who would raise the funds on royal warrants with a guarantee of some royal protection, but not much, to go out and seize assets abroad. The East India Company becomes, after the Dutch threw them out of what we now know as Indonesia, in the pursuit of nutmeg, then considered to be a cure for the Black Plague. When the Dutch resisted in Indonesian islands against the British East India Company, the East India Company moved to India. When they moved to India, they arrived as a private venture with their own forces to conquer India. And that's the history of the East India Company. They start with private armies. They rule, and by dividing and ruling, exploiting the divisions on the Indian continent. And eventually they create one of the most profitable looting, robbing operations the world's ever seen. Okay, that's what Trump is planning to do. What he's doing with Delcy Rodriguez and the defense minister, the interior minister in Venezuela, is exactly what the East India Company used to do to the various small kingdoms of and princelings of the Indian subcontinent as the East India Company developed its gigantic larceny operation in India. Of course, eventually the East India Company goes bankrupt, and what happens is the British state, the monarch, applies the British army to fight the wars to defend the interests that had been opened up commercially. That's right now exactly what Trump is doing. He's saying, if I want the oil companies of the United States to go into Venezuela, and because they won't, unless they get protection, I'm giving you US military protection, and I'm going to pay your bills. I'm going to cover all your investment risk with US government guarantees of various kinds. Whether that's going to work or not doesn't matter to the Trump gang, because they're going to get in the front end where the private equity speculators will raise money, and they will take their front end commissions and shares before there's any trouble on the Venezuelan landmass. But essentially the model is old-fashioned East India Company imperialism, and it works. Well, it doesn't work for 300, 400 years, but it can work for 50 years. How long is the Trump family calculating it's got on the clock? This is another mistake people make, and I need to point it out. The clock can work very lengthily, to put it this way, for the US empire's current tactics to work without a nuclear war. And they think it is working without a nuclear war. They think they've got the clock. The Russian side has to accept, and you quoted it, that what's happening is neo-colonial tactics. They even use the word neo-colonial or imperial in foreign ministry bulletins these days. Fine. If that's the case, let's take another good look at Julius Caesar's handling of the Turkish pirates in 75 BC. Crucifixion's the end for them. How soon, however, it took Caesar 38 days to get from being captured to putting the pirates in prison and then kill them, execute them. 38 days. Didn't take the Romans too long. It might take years for the Russian side to be convincing, the Chinese side to be convincing, the Indian side to be convincing. The clock can be stretched, but right now we shouldn't get too impatient.
Right. This is a big point that we could spend hours and hours debating, but I'm just going to drop it here as a footnote, and that is my own personal view, John, for what it's worth, is that the greatest threats to U.S. hegemony are not external to the United States; they're internal to the United States. That the mismanagement of the American economy, the growing fissures in American society, the neglect of the educational system, the infrastructure, and on, ultimately are going to be a greater contributor to the demise of U.S. hegemony than any particular external threat. The two will operate in tandem eventually to bring U.S. hegemony to an end. When that'll happen exactly, of course, no one can say with certainty. But I actually think that at the end of the day, it is the internal contradictions and failings of the U.S. government that will make the greatest contribution to its demise, the demise of its power. In any case, I don't want to, because we could talk about that for hours.
No, but I think it's important, if you don't mind. I
Sure.
think we have to mention the ICE killing in Minneapolis.
And that was foremost in my mind when I said what I just said. That is a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
However, I mean, let's just take a look at this, and I'm going back to my U.S. roots here. And so we're departing from the Russian argument. We're not departing from the Russian assessment, because let's suppose the Russian intelligence assessment that is fed to President Putin each day is much the same. Then it's also the same regarding Europe. The idea is, let's be patient. We mustn't do anything that mobilizes them around war against us. Let's not use rally round the flag to be used against us. Let's encourage, by our actions, splitting among our adversaries. Now, that's very clearly the way things should be thought of. Beijing, Delhi, Moscow, and what have you. And what's happening in Tehran is a very good example of what's to be avoided. Fifth columnists and the internal division that brings the regime down. Okay, what's happened in Minneapolis, and we're inviting a lot bigger expertise than I've got, is an example of the Stephen Miller approach that's been failing. Okay, the Stephen Miller is the Goebbels of the Trump regime. He not only develops the doctrine and ideology of violence inside, but he's mobilizing that violence and the military deployments to Los Angeles, Portland, and Chicago, Washington, D.C., and so on, to aim at winning the midterm elections, destroying the Democratic vote, etc., etc. That military occupation of those cities is failing, right? We saw they're pulling out the troops from the Democrat cities. First. Second, we see real nervousness on Trump's part in facing the midterm elections. Three, why should he be nervous? Because the polls show that even the Venezuela adventure has shifted his approval rating by 1 percentage point. That's less than the margin for statistical error. So what White House advisors like Miller see is violence, projection of power, victory on the battlefield isn't doing any more for Trump than making peace and winning Nobel Peace Prizes for peace that are fake. So what does Miller calculate? Well, Miller's calculating to move out of domestic policy and take the national security advisor's job away from Marco Rubio and go downstairs from his upstairs office in the White House to downstairs and next to Trump. The calculations then of people like Miller, supported by CIA and domestic departments, cabinet ministries, what's their calculation? They on the one hand, mobilize violence like ICE. And they think that triggering violence, defending violence, and Vice President Vance has defended the shooting in Minneapolis, will solidify their base and cause a rally round the flag effect for wayward Republicans. That's their calculation. So we have to look at it from the other side. Who's against that? Are the Democrats capable as a national party, not urban, not statewise, not even battleground state calculation? Is the Democratic Party capable of resisting violence? We know that some groups, particularly American blacks, are going to fight. The resistance is going to be quite active because they are threatened racially. There is white supremacism in Miller's behavior, his conduct, and his words, and in Trump's doctrines. So do we then project a level of internal breakup, internal violence that damages and destroys Trump's presidency? I leave it as a question. It's not a rhetorical one.
Yeah, it's a critically important question. And by the way, I think, again, we're going down a very important path, but it's nonetheless a kind of off the beaten path, or the one we're trotting today. This might solidify the base. It's, sad to say, if the victim was a black or brown person who was not a U.S. citizen, but a white woman who's a U.S. citizen being shot in the head at point blank range 3 times, when it's visible that the officer was not confronted by any lethal threat to kill her, I don't think that's going to solidify the base. But hey, what do I know? So in any case,
it's the problem to be dealt with is the political one. What's their calculation, and what's the best way of neutralizing it if you're resisting, if you're fighting? This is the politics of waging long-term war, and the politics of politics, winning power to avoid war, winning power to stop escalation dominance in the mind of people like Miller, in the smaller mind of the man he controls, Donald Trump. What's the method for deterring? And this isn't hopefulness. We're here not peddling hopefulness, optimism. We're trying to say this is the situation. The fact is Trump, for all the bluster, for all the feather puffing, for all the so-called excellent military operations, can only win against an undefended target, first. Second, he can't afford to lose, not mentally, not psychologically, not politically. A defeat is what Trump runs away from. It wasn't the Russian submarine and corvette that ran away from the effective use of force by the special forces landing on the Marinara. It was a Russian calculation. We won't be provoked this time. We will come up with a defeat for you that will be worse than this victory. And none of these victories are making any difference to Trump's approval rating. So he's, as it were, landing on the tanker but treading water. In fact, his whole ship, politically speaking, is taking water. It's leaking. So reason to resist have to have reasons. We also have to have methods to resist. We're not going to tell the Russian government, like the Napolitano gang, what it should do next, and get freebie trips to Moscow to be told what good boys you are for influencing U.S. public opinion, because Russian strategy is divide U.S. public opinion. There is no anti-war movement in the U.S., but there is the capability to defend against ICE, to defend against the National Guard in Los Angeles or Portland or whatever. And there will be resistance. Does a foreign state, Prime Minister Modi, President Putin, President Xi, calculate that a breakup inside the United States will have foreign policy influence in the short term? I don't think they do.
By the way, on that question of who chickened out, I saw a report that the the U.S. naval vessel was alongside this tanker for quite some time, and only boarded it when they saw when the Russian Navy appeared on the horizon. So they basically said, "We better get on this boat now while we can." So, one way to interpret what happened here is that it was in fact the U.S. forces that chickened out, because they boarded the vessel before the Russians could do anything to prevent the boarding.
Well, I wouldn't call that chickening out. I would say, and there is plenty of Russian military blogging that suggests that the US side decided to ignore the foreign ministry representations because the Russian side didn't arrive in time.
I see.
So the cavalry, you've got to go to the westerns, the movie westerns that everybody remembers. As it were, the wagon train had circled. The Russian flag was up. The diplomatic approach was tried. The Russian side had reason to believe the Americans would be deterred, but they were slow. So then you've got an argument at home in Moscow. Why didn't they have an overflight? The fast way of protecting the tanker was Air Force. You don't use helicopters, you use jet planes. They know how to go low. They've had low-level flyovers of US vessels as a deterrent in lots of different situations that we can remember in recent years. Why did the Russian side use a slow method by sea rather than a fast method? Why didn't they combine it? Is everybody on holiday in the general staff? Well, of course not. But these questions arise. I'm not going to debate the pros and cons because it's for a start, the evidence isn't available. But just to take the example you gave, I believe it to be true that the US side will take its advantage wherever it can, as quickly as it can. So if the situation was they decided to test the foreign ministry, then they got ready, and then they saw that the Navy was coming. This is how closely coordinated the US side has been. The Russian side didn't do something fast. Well, if that was a mistake, and I'm saying if, I'm not sure, you may be right, that mistake won't be repeated.
Okay, so we've been going for a little more than an hour here, but I really want to ask you about one other thing, John. Thank you for being generous with your time again. And that is that the Coalition of the Willing, or as I prefer to call it, the Coalition of the Killing, convened in Paris a few days ago. And at the conclusion of yet another sumptuous meeting at taxpayer expense, they put out yet another joint statement about security guarantees for Ukraine. And I'm just going to put it up on the screen here. So here's the Coalition of the Killing saying that we stand ready to commit to a system of politically and legally binding guarantees that will be activated once a ceasefire enters into force, in addition to bilateral security agreements in accordance with blah, blah, blah. And these will include the following components. 1, participation in a proposed US-led ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism, as though the US can be trusted by the Russian side to impartially and honestly monitor a ceasefire. 2, support for the armed forces of Ukraine, which would include critical long-term military assistance, long-term defense packages, support for financing the purchase of weapons, and so forth. Number 3, a multinational force for Ukraine made up from contributions from willing nations within the framework of the coalition. So this is obviously intended to suggest that the Europeans will provide forces for the multinational presence in Ukraine. 4, binding commitments to support Ukraine in the case of a future armed attack by Russia. Sounds, I mean, we don't know exactly what they have in mind here, but broadly speaking, that sounds like Article 5 of the NATO treaty. And 5, a commitment to deepen long-term defense cooperation with Ukraine. So and this, I'll keep my question simple here in the interest of time, John. I think that much, if not all of this, is a non-starter for the Russian Federation, including and particularly the multinational force, meaning European forces on Ukrainian soil, and the binding commitments to support Ukraine in the case of a future armed attack by Russia. So I see this as having been yet another signal from NATO that they are not prepared to do a deal on terms that they know Russia could accept, and that this is basically, and not as though there's real, meaningful peace negotiations going on anyways, but this is just another nail in the coffin of any kind of a peace deal being done anytime soon with the Russian Federation. So I was curious, is that also your assessment? Anything else about this that you think we should take away from it? Something I'm missing here? What's your assessment?
You don't miss much, Dimitri. Let me say that at the outset. Let me add a couple of things. First of all, from a Russian point of view, very few of these provisions are acceptable. Second, from a Russian strategic point of view, the task Moscow has to calculate with all of its on the battlefield actions is to try to increase the splitting between the French and the Germans and the English or the British and the Americans. That nothing should be done by the Russian side on the Ukraine battlefield that pulls them all together. And this is a document meant to pull all the allies together, starting with the US. So the Russian side sees this as another invitation to keep splitting them, with a big emphasis on splitting France from Germany. And let's wait to see when President Macron and President Putin pick up the phones to one another and talk again, as they've been proposing to do soon. The big principle here, from Russian point of view, is to stop and deter a German rearmament, making Germany the major European threat to Russian security, aided and abetted by the United States, much as Joe Kennedy wanted to aid and abet Hitler against the Soviet Union in the late 1930s when Joseph Kennedy was ambassador to the UK. So this is a paper whose motive on the European side triggers a Russian counter, and it has to trigger now the decision: does the Russian side accelerate its campaign to destroy the Ukrainian capacity to continue fighting? We've gone on for now 3 years to describe this as the electric war campaign. We've made the point that President Putin tried to restrict and put a brake on it, on the General Staff's plans. The General Staff is now fully exercised in escalating the electric war with the purpose of forcing the Ukraine to capitulation, right? But the Ukraine battlefield and what's left of the Ukrainian population and what's left of Ukrainian manpower are all readily sacrificable, not a very good adjective, readily to be sacrificed by the Europeans and the Americans. And Trump said it. If they want to go on fighting, okay, so long as they pay me for the weapons to kill the Russians. That's his line. Mm-hmm. The European line is a German line versus a French line, and with the desperate British trying to stay relevant. Okay, so there's the Europeans aren't lunatics either. They calculate that if they can maintain US involvement, they can pay the price in money, and the Ukrainians can pay the price in blood for continuing the long war against Russia, which suits the Chancellor of Germany just fine because it's the base for his rearmament. And it's also a fundamental doctrine in the Polish government's long-term thinking. So again, I see this as an example of long-term war against Russia, and Russia has to calculate how it responds on the battlefield to raise the price for each of these signatories. The destruction of the gas storage that was European is one example, but it's not a very vivid one. It won't come home to the gas users and consumers in Europe for a little while. It'll come home with shortages, it'll come home with blackouts and brownouts, it'll come home with increased energy prices. But so far, propaganda in Europe is holding the line against discovering that the war against Russia is costing Europeans more than they want to pay. Now, I've seen arguments in the US that this new piece of paper from the Europeans is like the Versailles Treaty. And like the Versailles Treaty, the argument runs, it's imposing on Russia and on the battlefield terms which will prolong the war, increase the likelihood of a wider war, as Versailles did from 1919 to 1939, 20 years. Well, the argument about this being as doomed as Versailles ignores the clock. Ignores the clock. The clock, as calculated by the Americans and the Europeans, is counting out against Putin. On the other side, the Russian sources tell me, and I've said it before, the clock has to be made to pause to enable Russia to build its capacities to fight this long war, because the Russian side understands what German ambition is. They understand how inimical the British will be. It must capitalize in the short term on their divisions, and it needs a pause to rebuild its military capacities to fight all the way up to Greenland, the Arctic route, because there's no doubt the Americans are going to try to stop the northern route, as the Russians call it, the Arctic Sea routes. They're going to try and stop that with all the tactics that they're adopting towards the Panama Canal and so on. Now, that's a strategic lengthening of war calculation, which in which the clock and escalation control are factors. So the other big difference between now and the Versailles Treaty is that Germany is much more than the Ukraine. There was no, ultimately, Adolf Hitler emerges as a capable unifier of Germany, which would not allow itself to be sacrificed the way Zelensky is doing to the Ukraine. Was Hitler, to put it bluntly, a betrayer of German lives in Germany as the Nazi Party rose to power, to the extent that we could say Zelensky has betrayed 20 million Ukrainian lives? No. This isn't like Versailles. It won't work like Versailles because the Ukraine is a sacrificial object in a long war against Russia. And we just have to understand that in that long war, Germany is a big threat, France a smaller threat. The two of them can be divided, and they can't function without a US ally. So it's elementary what the Russian side must do, but not in a hurry.
Well, my takeaway from this excellent conversation, John, it reminds me of the level of sophistication that is required to actually manage these types of conflicts. And it's something in which the Russian political and military and intelligence elites are deeply experienced. So, at times, I think it is important for us to do our best to understand internally the thinking. And oftentimes I myself will ask questions which seem skeptical, critical, but I'm really trying to understand their response here, because what I see on our side, and I use the word our loosely, of course, is a level of recklessness that is deeply concerning. This conversation has provided some comfort to me that Russia has a handle on things, but we'll have to see.
Well, hang on. I mean, it's an interesting point you're making, Dimitri. This is the new form of investigative journalism. Reason to resist has to have at least reason, meaning motive to resist, moral value to resist, doesn't it? And you've got that. And rationality for resisting. And what's rationality? Well, it means calculating all of the issues, factors, lives, blood, economic resources, and empty tankers. We have to calculate that to make the rational calculation. On top of that, we have to add the clock. What's rational now? What's rational midterms, November? What's rational later? So I can't think of another way of expressing rationality to resist that includes the clock. But we have to.
I couldn't have said it better myself, John. Thank you very much. I think you've summed it up very, very nicely. In any case, before we sign off, I just want to remind people, if you found this conversation to be informative, please do like and share the video. And please become a subscriber if you're not already one. And I wanted just to alert people to the fact that today we launched our French language channel, the partner channel of Reason to Resist in the French language. It's called Radio Résistance. And we launched it with a lengthy and really fascinating interview by Rami Yahya of the most censored comedian in Europe, an individual by the name of Dieudonné. So I recommend to people watch that. You don't have to speak French. We've subtitled it in English. And also follow us on Rumble just in case one day YouTube decides to sabotage us. So thank you very much for listening today. John, please take care. And I don't think I've had an opportunity yet to wish you a wonderful 2026. I hope that this is a very fruitful, prosperous, and peaceful year for you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you.
And we're signing off on January 10th, 2026.